Welcome to Reformed Thinking. This is the deep dive where we take the source material, God's Word, and the theological tradition that seeks to understand it, and we really wrestle with its implications for you today.
Our focus in this deep dive is a precept that is as brief as it is staggering. The Sixth Commandment, you shall not murder. It stands as a theological fence around one of the most sacred realities in the universe.
And our mission today is to go beyond, the simple police report idea of this command. We're examining why, in God's economy, the shedding of unauthorized human blood is not treated as just a social tragedy or a legal inconvenience, but as a theological outrage. It's an act of cosmic treason against the Creator.
That phrase, cosmic treason, it's established right away in the biblical narrative. Think about the very first murder in Genesis 4.
Cain and Abel.
Right. When Cain strikes down his brother Abel, God doesn't wait for human witness. He doesn't need forensic evidence. He confronts Cain and reveals something chilling. He says, he hears the voice of your brother's blood crying to me from the ground.
The Lord hears what the world tries to silence and bury. That victim's life. It speaks directly to the throne of God.
It does. It has a voice.
That is a staggering reality. It changes everything about how we view violence. So today we want to understand the radical implications of that sound. First, we'll need to define murder according to God's precise categories.
Then we'll take Christ's scalpel and search the heart, where he says the crime really begins.
And finally, we will present the radical remedy for blood guilt, which is found only in the gospel of Jesus Christ.
So we have to begin with clarity. While the Sixth Commandment is short, it's just 2 words in Hebrew, it is not at all vague. And you, the listener, need to understand that this is not a blanket prohibition against all taking of life.
Right. To treat all killing as morally identical is to just ignore the specific vocabulary that the lawgiver himself uses.
When I first encountered the difference between those Hebrew words, it felt like the entire command just snapped into focus. That clarity hinges entirely on the vocabulary God chose in Exodus 20.13.
Yeah, the specific Hebrew verb used is ratzak.
That is the crucial term. If God had wanted to outlaw all killing, whether in, self-defense, war, or by a magistrate, he could have used the more general verb harag, or maybe hemet, which is a general term for causing death.
But he didn't?
He didn't. He used lu tertzek, you shall not murder.
And when we look at how ratzak is used across the Old Testament, it reserves itself almost entirely for one type of action. What is that defining characteristic?
It is reserved for unlawful, culpable, and extrajudicial bloodshed. So it covers things like private violence, vengeance, malice, and injustice.
So it's, by definition, the unauthorized shedding of human blood. It's the individual operating outside of God's established authorities, asserting the prerogative of life and death for himself.
That's it. And the weight of this language choice is just immense for a Reformed understanding. It provides the theological basis for civil government, really.
Okay, so the command itself guards against 2 errors at the same time.
Yes. On the one hand, it guards against a kind of sentimentalism that would stop the magistrate from doing his God-appointed duty to punish violent evil.
And on the other, it guards against an anarchic pacifism that just refuses to acknowledge the moral categories that are needed to maintain a civil society.
Right. The Bible interprets Scripture. The very same law that forbids ratzak is the law that commands the civil magistrate to administer justice, even the severest penalty in Exodus 21.12.
So the state bears the sword as God's minister, which is what Romans 13 confirms.
Yeah.
This is authorized public action, not private malice.
So the difference is located not just in the outcome of death, but in the authority and the intent.
Right, and that is what takes us to the detailed framework laid out in Numbers 35, which forces the human court to apply this distinction with painstaking care.
Yeah, Numbers 35 details the moral framework for judging homicides, and it distinguishes the crime by intent. It draws a very stark line between premeditated malice intentional murder and a death that occurs without enmity or without lying in wait, which shows a lack of murderous purpose.
This keeps the legal system from just collapsing intent and outcome into one single category.
Which is what makes the cities of refuge so relevant. If God's system were based purely on outcome, the victim's relative, the avenger of blood, could immediately pursue and execute the killer. But God steps in and says, no, wait.
The cities of refuge were God's institution for ensuring due process and for mitigating that kind of unchecked vengeance. They gave the accidental killer time to get a measured hearing before the community elders.
And if they found the act was done without the deliberate intent to harm, the killer was protected inside the city. If malice was found, The killer was delivered back to the avenger.
This shows that God refuses to sanctify the vendetta. He teaches that guilt isn't measured solely by the fact that a death happened, but by the moral agency involved.
Was there hatred? Was there reckless disregard? Was the life treated as an object to be eliminated? All these questions matter.
It's a protection for the innocent, but also a moral framework for the guilty. It demonstrates the precision of God's justice. The man who intended to kill must face the highest penalty, the man whose act was heedless or unintentional. He still faces consequences, but not the ultimate one. It's a structured approach.
And this attention to motive is so critical because it shows us that the Sixth Commandment is not just a restrictive fence, it points us toward the law's positive duty.
So if God forbids unauthorized bloodshed, he must also be commanding the active preservation of life.
That is where the Reformed confessions and catechisms take us, following the biblical breadth. The prohibition, "you shall not murder," doesn't just require passive nonviolence, it demands active measures. It requires the cultivation of virtues that serve and protect our neighbor.
So we're instructed to resist destructive passions. We're talking about hatred, envy, settled rage, and that deep-seated desire for revenge that can fester for years. These are the internal poisons that lead to physical violence.
And we must actively practice the opposite virtues: patience, gentleness, restraint, and intentional peacemaking. The Westminster Larger Catechism reflects this by treating sinful anger, hatred, and bitterness as direct violations of the command.
So if you secretly wish ill upon your neighbor, or you cling to a long-held grudge, you are falling short of the positive duty to actively preserve their life and well-being.
The law essentially forces the question: do you treat your neighbor's life and dignity as a sacred thing that you are responsible for upholding, or as an obstacle you are justified in removing or diminishing?
And the answer to that question will reveal whether rat sex starts in your heart or not.
So we've established the proper terms. Now we have to address the theological justification for such severity. Why does God treat the unauthorized shedding of blood so much more seriously than, say, stealing?
To understand the gravity of murder as cosmic treason, we have to go back to the source. The sacredness of human life isn't based on our feelings or our political structures or our individual achievements. This dignity is rooted in a divine decree.
That is the anchor point. This takes us directly back to the Imago Dei, the image of God in Genesis 1. This is the absolutely non-negotiable reason that human life is set apart from the rest of the created order.
And the core ethical implication here is that the Imago Dei is a bestowed dignity, not some kind of earned badge. It's a status granted at creation. And this truth, when you take it seriously, it demolishes every sliding scale by which society tries to quantify human worth.
The world constantly pressures us to accept that worth is tied to usefulness. If dignity rests on function, on ability, productivity, or convenience, then you can justify disposing of anyone who becomes a drain on society or an inconvenience to personal desire.
And that includes the unborn, the elderly, the severely disabled, or those deemed unproductive.
But if dignity rests on God's eternal decree, then every human being possesses an inviolable, non-negotiable worth that no circumstance, not disability, not moral failings, not age can erase.
It remains even after the fall.
It does. Genesis 9:6 confirms that even after sin entered the world, bloodshed demands recurring precisely because God made man in his own image. That rationale remains the moral constant across all generations and all covenants.
So the image is not a reward for moral virtue. It's a reality of creation that demands respect from every other image bearer.
Moving from God's image in man to God's authority over man, we then confront the second major ground for the sanctity of life: divine sovereignty. Our sources insist that life is the exclusive property of the Creator.
Yeah, we have to remember we are not self-made. We confess with Job, "The Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life." God is not just the one who started life, he is the one who continually sustains it.
The psalmist marvels that God knits life together in the womb in Psalm 139.
So when a person stands before a magistrate or a medical procedure or even an enemy, the question of life and death is never simply their body, their choice, or my decision. Our lives are property of the Creator by the right of creation.
And only He holds the keys of life and death.
Therefore, murder is not only an injury to the neighbor, it's primarily a theft from God. It's a grasping at divine prerogatives. As Deuteronomy 32 says, "I, even I, am He, and there is no God beside me. I kill and I make alive."
To murder is to attempt to steal those keys. It is a declaration of independence from the sovereign, making it the highest form of treason.
And the Bible deepens the significance of humanity even further by pointing to the Incarnation's witness. The fact that the Son of God did not come to redeem angels, but instead took on human nature, flesh and blood, that's the most dramatic declaration of the eternal worth of humanity.
I mean, think about the implication. God honored humanity enough to wrap himself in it, and the cross shows us the collision of all these truths.
It shows what murder is, sinful men unjustly shedding innocent blood, and yet through that very act, God provides the atoning mercy that cleanses us from all blood guilt.
So if the life of every person is so valuable that God roots its dignity in his own image and sovereignty and validates it through the incarnation, then the church must treat every human being with a kind of trembling reverence.
If we limit the Sixth Commandment to just the act of the hand, we really miss the law's spiritual diagnosis. This is the transition from the external prohibition to the internal problem, from the deed to the root.
And no one makes this diagnosis clearer than the lawgiver himself, Jesus Christ, in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5. He's not abolishing the command, he's showing its inner spiritual reach.
He tells us that the sin of murder begins long before a weapon is ever lifted.
Right. The Pharisees thought they were righteous because they hadn't committed homicide. Christ, looking into the Spirit, declares that the one who harbors anger against his brother is liable to judgment. He takes the commandment entirely beyond the reach of the civil court and places it squarely before the judgment seat of God.
The Apostle John drives this truth home in what should be a deeply uncomfortable verse for every single churchgoer who thinks they're doing fine. He says, "Everyone who hates his brother is a murderer."
Hatred is murder in principle. If you allow hatred to live and thrive in your spirit, you have already committed the sin.
This forces us to spend time with Christ's terrifying analysis of the progression of this sin, what's often called the genealogy of hatred. It shows how contempt escalates from an internal emotion to the warrant for eternal judgment.
And Jesus starts by speaking of continuous anger.
The Greek used there, the present passive participle orgizomenos, is such a devastating detail. It's not the momentary, justifiable flash of temper that comes and goes. This signifies a continuous, settled, brooding condition.
Nursed resentment, an intentional posture of hostility toward your neighbor. It's the anger of a settled mindset, not the anger of a fleeting moment.
And the moment that settled resentment finds a voice, the transgression escalates to the second stage, contempt, which Jesus labels with the Aramaic epithet raka.
Which roughly translates to worthless one or empty-headed.
So to say raka is to look at a person stamped with God's insignia, the Imago Dei, and verbally pronounce them valueless. You are denying their inherent dignity.
And this verbal assault, Christ warns, makes one liable to the council, the Supreme Court of Israel. The tongue has committed a capital crime against dignity.
The final, highest stage is moral apostasy, calling a brother, "thou fool," moros. This isn't a mild intellectual insult. In the biblical sense, it implies a moral rebel, someone who is spiritually bankrupt or defying God.
And this verbal act warrants the ultimate penalty, the Gehenna of fire.
Gehenna, of course, references the Valley of Hinnom, which had become synonymous with perpetual burning and judgment. So Jesus is teaching that the seemingly respectable sin of hateful speech, the devaluing of a person in your heart, warrants the eternal wrath of God.
The distance between heart hatred and physical violence is often only opportunity, not nature.
And we see this progression played out again and again in the historical narratives of Scripture. These stories trace the dark roots that produce bloodshed, starting with the archetype, Cain.
Cain's murder in Genesis 4 was not accidental. It was the result of two deeply ingrained sins, envy and pride. God accepted Abel's offering, but not Cain's.
Cain should have corrected his offering, but instead his pride refused correction, which then curdled into resentment toward his brother.
God warns him. He says, "If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you, but you must rule over it."
But Cain refused the call to self-mastery. The anatomy of envy is always this: if I cannot have joy or acceptance, neither shall you. He eliminated the evidence of his own failure by eliminating his brother.
The narratives also show how much more insidious murder can become when it's, sanitized, mediated through power, and dressed up as necessary procedure.
You're thinking of David and Uriah in 2 Samuel 11.
Yes. David does not lift the sword himself. He commits adultery, then deception, then finally he wields his authority. He writes a letter commanding his general, Joab, to place Uriah in the hottest part of the battle so he will die under enemy fire.
It's the sin of delegation. David used the legitimate institution of warfare to satisfy his private lust and fear. He thought distance and a plausible account, he died honorably in battle, would conceal the crime.
But the prophet Nathan exposes the truth immediately. He says David has despised the word of the Lord and acted as a murderer.
This teaches us that murder is not only the sin of the rage-filled thug, it's the temptation of the powerful king. Authority can murder just as surely as brute force, using official procedure and distance as a disguise.
And a third terrifying example is institutional murder. Ahab and Naboth in 1 Kings 21. This isn't just about an angry heart. This is about weaponizing the law itself.
Ahab wanted Naboth's vineyard. His wife Jezebel created a flawless legal procedure. She used false witnesses, manipulated the elders, and invoked a national fast to make the whole community complicit.
So Naboth was murdered by being legally, judicially executed on false charges. It was murder dressed in the costume of legality.
Yet when the prophet Elijah confronts Ahab, God cuts right through all the paperwork and asks, "Have you murdered and also taken possession?" God sees the heart of the matter, even when the deed is hidden behind a state seal and bureaucratic procedure.
These narratives, Cain, David, Ahab, they all show that the common thread is idolatry. When desire becomes a god, whether that desire is for acceptance or for a woman or for a piece of property, people cease to be image bearers and become sacrifices to that idol.
And finally, we have to mention the dehumanizing tongue. The tongue can be spiritually and socially murderous, and we see this danger acutely in the digital age.
James warns that the tongue can be a world of unrighteousness. Contempt reduces an image bearer to a label, making it psychologically and spiritually easier to harm them later.
Racism, classism, and the political language of demonization are all sins of the tongue because they deny the dignity of the image they bear. They train the heart to despise, and that contempt is the prelude to every form of violence.
Recognizing this pervasive wickedness, that the potential for Ratzak lives in every human heart, we now have to address how God responds to this in a fallen world.
Right. God does not abandon humanity to a perpetual blood feud. He restrains evil through appointed civil order, which is his common grace provision.
And this structure of restraint is defined by magistracy and the sword. The New Testament confirms that civil authority is God's servant for your good, and that the magistrate does not bear the sword in vain, for he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. That's Romans 13.
So the sword represents real, coercive authority to restrain violent evil and to punish wrongdoing, but it's a delegated authority. It doesn't mean the state is autonomous. The state is accountable to God for how it wields that sword.
And this structure is precisely why you, as a Christian, have to make a clear and principled distinction between public justice and private vengeance.
Romans 12 instructs the believer, "Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God." So the Christian is personally forbidden from administering retaliation or satisfying a private grievance.
But Romans 13 confirms that public justice, administered by the state, is one of the ordinary means by which God executes temporal wrath and restrains evil. The sword belongs to the magistrate, not to the offended individual.
This distinction forces the believer toward mercy and forgiveness in their private life, while still submitting to and upholding the public structure of justice when they are the victim.
Which brings us to due process. Why is due process witnesses, careful adjudication, the presumption of innocence, so critical to the Sixth Commandment?
Because God's justice must be measured, principled, and public. If the state unjustly executes an innocent man, the state itself has committed Ratzak.
The cities of refuge show God protecting society from both unpunished malice and from the disaster of the innocent being swept away by mob passion. Justice must protect the accused as a moral duty to the Imago Dei.
Which is why we have the necessity of 2 or 3 witnesses from Deuteronomy 19 and careful adjudication. It protects the innocent from hasty judgment and political corruption, just like in the story of Naboth.
So the Sixth Commandment protects life from the murderer, but it also protects life from wrongful conviction and unlawful punishment by the state itself. Justice must be sober, slow enough to be careful, and firm enough to be real.
This returns us to the critical moral distinctions. What killing is not murder. We have to be clear here without creating moral loopholes.
First, as we established, lawful civil justice, when it's administered under God-ordained authority and due process, is not murder. When the magistrate punishes wrongdoers, he is operating as God's servant.
But even severe punishment has to be pursued with rigorous evidence and a kind of moral fear, because the magistrate answers to God for innocent blood. The temptation for the state is always to become a god unto itself.
Second, the defense of life against unjust aggression is not murder. Proverbs 24 calls God's people to rescue those who are being taken away to death. If you stop immediate, unprovoked harm to the innocent, you are fulfilling a positive duty of the law.
But this act has to always be constrained by necessity and proportionality. Defense is oriented towards stopping immediate harm, not satisfying wounded pride. The force used must be sufficient to stop the aggression and nothing more.
And the moral difficulty arises when the heart delights in the harm, even if the action was legally justified. That delight is the spiritual seed of Ratzak.
Third, war. War is considered a matter of magistracy and a tragic necessity at best, as the Reformers categorized it. It's never a private revenge on a national scale. It's morally permissible only when approached as a means to restore peace and restrain grievous evil.
The church should be the last place to romanticize bloodshed. Even when recognizing that magistrates may have just occasions to bear the sword externally, war is a lamentable consequence of the fall. It is not a moral blank check or a theater for human glory.
So we recognize the legitimacy of the function while weeping for the necessity of the carnage.
These distinctions prevent us from being either too strict saying all killing is murder, or too soft saying that a public authorized act somehow purifies the heart of malice. The law demands both justice and restraint.
In our present age, the application of the Sixth Commandment is urgent because we live in what is accurately called a culture of death. The modern world increasingly measures worth by metrics of usefulness, autonomy, or personal desire, which renders life negotiable.
And the Christian must insist that dignity is inviolable because God decreed it so. We are called to a positive, costly, public-minded love that protects life and refuses every narrative that dehumanizes.
This requires confronting socially sanctioned killing.
And the most glaring and grievous violation of the Sixth Commandment today, because of its scale and the vulnerability of the victim, is abortion.
This can't be viewed as simply a political controversy. It is a theological crisis, the shedding of innocent blood. It is, in its essence, the sacrifice of children to the idol of convenience and the god of self.
Scripture's detailed descriptions of divine involvement are unequivocal. God knits life in the womb, he forms, sustains, and knows the person there. Psalm 139 is just crystal clear on this.
To interrupt that process is an assault on God's creative prerogative. When a society allows the mass extraction of the image of God based on personal desire, it trains the heart of the entire culture to despise the weak and the inconvenient. It violates the whole premise that life is sacred property.
And we see a similar underlying logic at the other end of life's spectrum with euthanasia and assisted suicide. While it's framed in terms of compassion and medical assistance, this is the ultimate assertion of the idol of autonomy. It's the final, tragic claim that my life is my own to dispose of as I see fit.
But our sources tell us that life is the Creator's property. Taking one's own life, or assisting in the taking of life, is stealing the keys of death from Christ, who alone holds them. Revelation 1 makes that clear. This is self-treason.
True mercy is not elimination. It is presence, patience, and care in suffering. The church must embody a compassion that supports endurance and covenant love, refusing the temptation to define mercy as the removal of pain by removing the person.
Now, we have to turn Christ's radical interpretation onto the church itself. The Sixth Commandment confronts the silent killers within our own hearts and communities, the sins we tolerate because they're not illegal or physical crimes.
We must confront partiality, classism, and racism. James 2 specifically calls partiality a transgression. To deem another person less than based on skin color, economic status, or social persuasion is to deny the dignity of the image they bear. It's a functional assault on the Imago Dei.
So if we treat the poor man or the marginalized person as if their perspective doesn't count or their life isn't worth protecting, we have fallen into that Raka mindset. We have reduced a soul bearing God's image to a worthless one, setting the stage for disregard and systemic neglect.
Another deeply pervasive silent killer is bitterness and unforgiveness. To harbor grudges for decades is a slow-acting poison that kills the one who holds it and spiritually murders the one upon whom it is directed.
Why is unforgiveness spiritual homicide? Because to refuse forgiveness to a genuinely repentant person or to hold on to a grudge long past its expiration is to steal God's seat as judge.
You are attempting to reserve the right to punish eternally, wishing damnation or temporal judgment upon another person, usurping the role that belongs only to the avenger of blood, which we are forbidden to take for ourselves.
And finally, we must govern the tongue, which in the digital square today is often a weapon of mass character destruction. Slander, gossip, and public mockery assassinate character and kill reputations. We are participating in the sin of Naboth's false witnesses.
The Christian must actively refuse the culture of contempt that rewards sarcasm, snark, and the public shredding of opponents online. We must train our hearts to despise contempt itself, refusing to label our brother or sister in a way that denies the dignity of the image they bear.
The commandment requires us to put away wrath, clamor, and malice, as Ephesians says, and to pursue reconciliation quickly, even prioritizing it over worship, which is what Matthew 5 teaches.
When we allow the law, especially Christ's radical interpretation in Matthew 5, to speak its full truth, it brings us to the dreadful reality of blood guilt. We are all exposed. Every one of us stands guilty of the murderous heart, whether by hand, by tongue, or by venomous thought.
The law does its work here. It insists that human life, once unjustly taken or wished away, cannot be repaid by human effort. No amount of good deeds, no apology, no penance can purchase innocence or raise the dead. The law's function is to strip away all our self-justifications and drive us to confess.
We are truly bloodstained.
And we must not confuse God's pardon with the removal of all temporal accountability. Forgiveness removes the eternal penalty for the repentant sinner, but justice often demands consequences in this life.
We see this vividly in David's case. He was forgiven when he confessed his sin regarding Uriah, but the prophet declared, "The sword shall never depart from your house."
True repentance submits to lawful authority and accepts temporal consequences rather than seeking to evade them.
But if the law is the relentless avenger of blood, then the gospel provides the only refuge. Here, we return to that beautiful Old Testament typology, the city of refuge, the Ir Miklat.
The city of refuge was the designated place of safety for the fugitive from the avenger of blood. The one who fled there was safe, but only under two critical conditions. First, he had to remain within the walls, and second, his safety was secured only until the death of the high priest.
Once the high priest died, the fugitive was free.
And that typology finds its consummation in Jesus Christ. He is the true city of refuge for the soul pursued by the guilt of sin. The law demands our life, but Christ opens his wounds and invites us to hide in him, the ultimate fortress.
But how can a just God shelter the guilty? The answer is the great exchange. Our safety is purchased with a price. The remedy for murder is found in the most heinous, public, and definitive act of murder in history, the crucifixion.
The cross was the ultimate violation of the Sixth Commandment.
Yet, God used this greatest injustice as the means of atonement. The guilt of our hatred, our anger, our raka statements, and our moral apostasy was credited to Jesus Christ. He stood in the place of the murderer and took the judgment we deserved.
We go back to Genesis 4. Abel's blood cried for judgment. It demanded retribution from the ground. But Hebrews 12 tells us that Christ's blood, sprinkled onto the mercy seat in heaven, cries a better word.
It cries mercy, reconciliation, peace. He satisfies the avenger of blood, the justice of God, so that the sword is sheathed forever for those who are sheltered in him.
And this gospel is not for the politely broken. It's for the genuinely bloodstained. Think of Paul, who described himself as breathing threatenings and slaughter against the church. He held himself up as a trophy of mercy so that Jesus Christ might display his perfect patience in him.
No stain is too deep that Christ's blood cannot cleanse it.
And from that pardon flows the necessary consequence of new obedience, not as the price of forgiveness, but as its fruit. This is the third use of the law, guiding our gratitude.
Justification brings regeneration. We are not free to remain the same person that fled into the city of refuge.
The Holy Spirit teaches us to put to death the murderous impulses of the old man, to mortify anger, to renounce contempt, and to refuse vengeance. New obedience is the active preservation of life, replacing the sword of bitterness with the towel of service.
The forgiven saint, knowing the terror of the law, seeks reconciliation and the protection of the vulnerable.
To summarize our deep dive for you, we have seen that the Sixth Commandment is lo tertzak, forbidding unauthorized bloodshed, not all killing. We understand that dignity rests entirely on God's image, making life the sacred property of the Creator.
And Christ showed us that the heart, filled with contempt and hatred, is where the crime truly begins, convicting every one of us.
The gospel answers this widespread guilt by providing Christ, our eternal high priest and our secure city of refuge, whose blood secures mercy through the satisfaction of justice.
We are redeemed from blood guiltiness so that we may live not just as people who avoid the act of killing, but as active guardians of life. We're called to embody a culture of reconciliation and affirmation.
We should be the people who cultivate kindness and compassion, especially for those who are most despised or most vulnerable.
So the final challenge for you to reflect on is this. If Christ's blood cleanses the most violent sin of hatred and malice, how must we, his redeemed people, actively overcome evil with good?
How must we live and speak and serve in a way that embodies a culture of reconciliation, especially toward those whom the world, or our own sinful pride, trains us to despise and devalue?